Was the Big 12 Conference underrated in 2024? We find out tonight. Welcome to the Nitro College Football Show, college football from a Georgia point of view. I'm Burl.
And I'm Streit.
And this week, Georgia's kicking off spring practice, but we'll talk about that more next week when some news comes out of it, and we'll keep you updated there. And today, we're going to be looking at the Big 12 and grading all the teams in the Big 12 based off of their 2024 season.
Just remember that all of our previous conference grade videos are available here on the channel. This is the last of that series of videos, and we look forward to hearing from you. Please leave us comments on what you thought of the series of videos.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been kind of a gauntlet type situation with grading all these teams. How many are we going to end up doing in the long run?
I think around 68.
One away.
I know.
Well, cool. All right. Big 12. What happened in the Big 12 this year?
Well, so the Big 12 survived this year. They were under threat of going away when all these teams started changing conferences and everything. And the Big 12 lost its two best teams in Texas and Oklahoma. People were worried that the Big 12 was going to die, but they kind of threw a Hail Mary and started taking some teams away from the Pac-12 that was dying itself and built itself into a new conference. So obviously they lost Texas and Oklahoma this year, but they added Arizona, Arizona State, Colorado, and Utah from the Pac-12. And they ended up back with 16 teams, which this is the Big 12 conference. It now has 16 teams. For a long time, it only had 10 teams. They need to do away with these numbered conference team names because none of them are right.
They really do. They don't make any sense. Like, I get branding and all that stuff, but when your brand is wrong, I mean, I can't buy it.
Yeah. So some other things that happened this year, there were a couple new coaches in the league this year. Willie Fritz took over at Houston. Brett Brennan took over at Arizona. And the biggest story of the year, probably in the Big 12 this year, outside of the ascension of Arizona State, was Colorado making highlights across the country, particularly with Travis Hunter, a great two-way player who won the Heisman Trophy. He was at the head of a lot of the awards that the conference won. The overall offensive awards for the conference this year, Offensive Player of the Year, was quarterback Shedeur Sanders, the guy throwing Hunter the ball at Colorado. The Defensive Player of the Year was Travis Hunter. As we mentioned, he played wide receiver. He also was an excellent defensive back and was named the conference Defensive Player of the Year. The Coach of the Year in the conference was Kenny Dillingham from Arizona State.
Dillingham.
Yep. The Offensive Freshman of the Year was Sam Levitt, the quarterback from Arizona State. And the Defensive Freshman of the Year was Josiah Trotter, linebacker from West Virginia. The season came down to conference championship. Arizona State took on Iowa State. Arizona State was hot and really beat them down in that game, 45-19. And they were the lone team from the conference to move on to the college football playoff, actually earning the number 4 seed into the playoff, jumping up ahead of the ACC. So Arizona State got a bye, and we'll talk more about what happened to them in the playoffs.
When I was going through and reviewing all these teams and coming up with my grade and everything, I was more impressed with the Big 12 than I was expecting. There was a lot of teams that had some really good records, and they were on the cusp. And I guess I was expecting worse because it wasn't SEC, it wasn't Big 10. So, I feel like the conference is a little bit underrated. What do you think?
I think it was. I think there were some good teams in this conference. I think there were also some teams that had rough years. Even a couple teams that had been good in previous seasons had some rough years. But overall, I think the conference was pretty solid. Definitely a step below the SEC and the Big 10, kind of on par, with the ACC that we talked about last week.
Yeah, I agree. All right, before we dive into grades, we want to thank you for spending your time with us tonight. Hit that like button on this video, really helps us out, builds engagement. We're all about engagement. Drop some comments. If you haven't already, if you made it this far, subscribe to the channel, tell your friends. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and if you're listening to us on audio through Spotify or Apple iTunes podcast, leave us a like, leave us a review. That also helps us grow the channel. We'd love to hear from you, so please leave some comments.
Speaking of comments, we have lots to say about Arizona State, winners of the Big 12. Give us a rundown on them.
Yeah, Arizona State was a great story in college football as a whole this year. They only went 3-9 last year in Kenny Dillingham's first season down there. And this year they were picked to finish last in the conference preseason. And lo and behold, they ended up winning the conference, came with that close of beating Texas in the playoffs and finished number 7 in the country. Just a really, really good transition year into a new conference for Arizona State. What are your thoughts on Arizona State, bro?
Yeah, I thought they had an amazing year. Like you said, being picked to finish last in the Big 12 and winning the whole damn thing. I mean, that's a feat in itself. I thought the emergence of Kenny Dillingham was interesting because he showed up and, man, did he have some swagger about him. Like he is fired up. He's a high energy, in your face coach, and that worked for them. And it, the team kind of embodied that mentality.
Yeah, he's a really good story too. If you don't know much about him, he actually grew up there in Tempe. And he grew up, he said jokingly that he could see the stadium from his house growing up. He grew up an Arizona State fan, and he came back home to take over a program that was kind of down in the dumps, headed to a new conference, and has immediately found success. They got off to, a good start. They had wins over Kansas and Utah early in the season after playing some bad competition, but then they had a couple of head scratcher of losses in there too. They lost to Texas Tech and they lost to Cincinnati before getting hot again at the end of the year and kind of closing it out strong, particularly in that last 6-game stretch where they were winning every week. They had 3 wins over ranked opponents. And the big one was the 45-19 beatdown of Iowa State in the Big 12 championship.
Yeah, and they had some other great stories along the way too. Sam Levitt was really, really good, and the big one being Cam Scatabo, just a monster in the backfield that no one really knew about until near the end of the season when he started getting some more national games in the Big 12 championship and made a huge impact in the playoffs.
He had an absolutely ridiculous season. Like, just looking at the stats, you're like, wow, this dude was really almost everything for this team. The guy had 1,700 yards rushing, 21 rushing touchdowns. He also had 605 receiving yards on 45 catches and 3 more touchdowns receiving, 24 total touchdowns, and he even threw a touchdown pass in the playoff game.
Scatabo killed it in that game. He led the team in rushing and receiving in that game against Texas, against an elite defense.
Right.
This is not just some, wet paper towel type of defense. Texas has a legit defense, and they could not stop him. He's just impressive.
Yeah. They were the number 4 seed because they were a conference champion, got the bye into the playoff, went up against Texas. Everybody was like, Texas is going to kill them. Texas did not kill Arizona State. They got out to a lead, and Arizona State fought and fought and fought. Got back. They got the game to overtime. They probably actually should have won the game because of a bad call that didn't give them a chance to win. There was a no call on that should have been called for targeting, and it wasn't.
Forgot about that.
Yeah, that call would have set them up to get a field goal to win the game at the end of regulation. But they ended up losing in double overtime. Texas beats them 39-31. But, overall, just an amazing season for Arizona State. First year in the conference, picked to finish dead last, wins the conference, makes some noise in the playoffs. You've got a young rising coach in Kenny Dillingham. Just a great year overall. In terms of giving them a grade for this season, I don't think you can ask for much more. They didn't make it to the Natty. They didn't win a Natty, but their expectations, like I said, were last in the conference. So for that, I gave them an A.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I gave them an A as well. Same reason. They're picked last in the conference. They win it, and they come so close to knocking off Texas in playoff game and advancing, which would have been wild. Like that would have been probably the biggest upset in the playoffs. So I give them an A, just a great story, great, phenomenal year. As far as their record goes, they get an A minus. And so for the Nitro Show 2024 grade for the Arizona State Sun Devils is an A minus.
All right. Up next, we have the BYU Cougars. In 2023, they went 5-7. And in 2024, they were much improved, going 11-2 under ninth-year head coach Kalani Sitake. They ended up finishing number 13 in the country in the AP poll and 14th in the coaches poll. And this was a season of improvement for BYU. They improved by 6 wins in their second year in the Big 12 Conference. Great year for them. They started out 9-0, and they got as high as number 6 in the country. Including a 38-9 destruction of Kansas State, who had kind of been one of the class teams of the Big 12 the last few years. They defeated their in-state rival, Utah. It was the first time that the game had been played since 2021. So even though Utah ended up having a rough season, that was kind of a big deal for them. And overall, they were just a very strong defensive football team. They finished 13th in the country in defense, 18th in scoring, and they led the country with 22 interceptions.
Yeah, those rivalry games, you can't really look at the score and gauge how the team is for the year.
Right.
You just never know what's going to happen in those.
After that 9-0 start, unfortunately, they were eyeing the playoffs, and maybe they looked a little too far ahead because they ended up suffering 2 losses that ended up dashing both their conference championship hopes and their playoff hopes. The first was an upset loss to Kansas, who is a weird team that got hot at the end of the year, even though they were really bad early in the season. And then they ended up losing to Arizona State. They ended up finishing it in 2, got them into a bowl game where they faced conference opponent Colorado. Why? That's weird, but I guess in this day and age of much bigger conferences and less conferences, that's going to work out. And they just absolutely beat the crap out of them in the bowl game.
Yeah, in impressive season, pretty easy schedule, but they did win all the games that they were supposed to win, with the exception of the Kansas game, and they did get a win over SMU playoff team. I think that was before Jennings was starting quarterback, but I could be wrong there. I don't know. Not a huge deal. But yeah, that was a good win, and the games that they lost, they were 1-possession games, 1-score games, so it wasn't like any team just destroyed them. They were right on the cusp of making the playoff. If they beat Kansas, there's a good chance that they are in the playoff.
Absolutely. They would have had one loss, and they would have had one loss going to the conference championship game. And even if they would have lost to Arizona State there, they'd already played Arizona State once. So at 11-2, they absolutely would have gotten into the playoffs, probably over SMU at that point. Overall, this was an impressive year for BYU. They were picked to finish 13th and come into the season. They ended up finishing number 13 in the country. So from 13th in the conference to 13th in country is pretty impressive. I did see a BYU blog when it was talking about the season that they ranked this season as one of the 4 greatest seasons in school history. I don't know much about the history of BYU football. I know they've won a national title before, but that's pretty high from somebody who's a fan who covers them. So they viewed this season very well. They had the highest attendance in the conference this year, so the excitement around the program is certainly there. I think it was a great year for BYU, so I gave them an A minus.
Yeah, I thought it was a great year for them too. They had a really good record. Their losses weren't bad. They were really close. I ended up going with a B plus just because it was a good season. It was a really, really good season. So their grade for their record, since They were on the cusp of making the playoff. That gets them up to a B. And for their final grade, the Nitro Show 2024 final grade for your BYU Cougars. I like that. I like saying that, Cougars.
Not the kind that hang out at Johnny's Hideaway.
Oh, Johnny's Hideaway. Bless it. And so, yeah, their final grade is a B. Not bad. Not bad. Next up, we got Iowa State.
Yeah, so Iowa State last year was a 7-6 football team. Kind of disappointing because they'd kind of been seen as one of these teams that was always on the cusp, right? Matt Campbell is a fantastic coach coming into his 8th season this year. They went 11-3. This was a really, really strong year for Iowa State. They ended up finishing number 15 in the country. And this was arguably the most successful season in their program's history. This was the first time that they won 10 games in their school's 133-year history.
Wow.
Not only did they win 10 games, they won 11 games. And they ended up getting as high as number 11 in the rankings. They started out 7-0, and they beat their in-state rival Iowa for only the second time in the last 9 seasons, 20-19. This was a game that they were losing 13-0 at halftime, but they were able to come back and get the win. And they were going good. They were 7-0, and then they had back-to-back losses to Texas Tech and Kansas, and that kind of derailed their season.
Yeah, that was kind of weird because they were rolling. They were a really exciting team to watch. Rocco Beck, another great name, right up there with Cam Scatabo. Most of their games were super close, though. So, I mean, maybe it wasn't that shocking that they lost to Texas Tech, because Texas Tech actually ended up being a much better team than you would think.
Yeah. And they had 5 players on the Big 12 All-Conference team, led by their star receiver, Jaden Higgins. He was a third-team All-American, had 87 catches for over 1,100 yards and 9 touchdowns. And then their defense was consistent. If anything, they allowed under 26 points a game again this year for the 8th consecutive season. One of only 8 teams in the country who can say that. And I know 26 points is not a super low number for a defense, but the fact that there's only been 8 teams in the country that have done that every season for the last 8 years, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah. And then, thinking about it, going back 8 years, the old Big 12 was all offense.
Right.
So that's impressive.
Yeah, and another thing about this team was they were the least penalized team in the country. So that says a little bit about the discipline that Matt Campbell's installed there. And they closed out their season with a big win over Miami in the Pop-Tarts Bowl.
Great.
Once again, our favorite bowl game to talk about. And you can say all you want about Miami, about Cam Ward leaving the game, but they fought back and they won that game, and it gave them a school record 11 wins on the season. So for it being the best season in their school's history, I gave them a B+, though maybe I should have given them an A, because that's pretty fantastic season for them.
I agree. Very exciting team. The only real bad blemish on their season was getting kind of blown out by Arizona State. I mean, it's like 20-something point spread or victory there for Arizona State. But they did make the conference championship. That's a really good year, and they have one of my favorite team names, the Cyclones, because they're lovingly known as the Clones, and there's a big Star Wars tie-in there. Say go Clones. There's a lot of people that wear Clone Wars helmets. I'm all about it. So yeah, I ended up giving them a B+ as well. I thought it was a really fantastic season for them, and just a great year overall. And they were on the cusp of the playoff.
Yeah, they were.
I mean, them playing in your conference championship game, you got a chance there.
Well, they would have had an automatic bid if they would have won that game.
Exactly. So for that, that gets their record grade as a B.
So in 2024, the Nitro Show grade for the Iowa State Cyclones is a B.
You almost said Hawkeyes.
I know I did. I'm off a little bit tonight. I'm not crisp.
What are you talking about?
I'm not crisp like I was last week. I'm a little bit off tonight.
No,
This is the fun one, man. This is the most fun one to talk about.
Oh, get ready.
You want to start, or you want me to? I got lots.
Come on, haters.
I got lots to hate.
Do your worst. We know you Colorado folks don't like us, but we don't care.
Up next, we have the Colorado Buffaloes, the most interesting team in the country. At least the media would have you believe that. In 2023, their first year under Dion, they went 4-8. This year was a huge improvement. They went 9-4. But was that 9-4 really good? Should it have been better? Should they have not celebrated quite as much? Maybe. Let's take a little bit further deep dive into Colorado, who ended up finishing number 25 in the country. This is a really hard team to grade because recent history tells us that this is a bad football team and a bad football program. 2 years ago, they won 1 game. Last year, they won 4 games. So they went 9-4 this year, and that's a great improvement under Deion Sanders. His philosophy of bringing in transfers and his guys and his control and his way. Some people love it, some people hate it. But if you look at the results on the field this year, they were much better than what they've been in the past. But then you ask yourself, was that record and this inflated record and stats and all that, was that a result of having 2 of the best offensive players in the country? Because he had Shedeur Sanders, arguably one of the best quarterbacks in the country, and he had Travis Hunter, who won the Heisman Trophy.
Yeah.
So they would look totally awesome at times, and then other times they would look totally unmotivated.
Yeah. I think Colorado is the most overrated team in college football, 2024, hands down. Looking at their schedule, their record, they don't have any impressive wins. No wins over ranked teams at the time they played them. They lost to the only ranked team that they played and got destroyed. Granted, it was a bowl game and people weren't caring about it as much, but still, I mean, it still counts towards your record and is important for our grades. It's what makes it even worse is you go 9-4, you've got a pretty cake schedule, and you have potentially the number 1 and 2 picks in the upcoming NFL draft. Any other school where you have that kind of talent at the top of your program, if you don't win your conference at least, that coach is on the hot seat. It makes no sense why this is not being talked about by other people. I don't get it. I mean, Deion has brought more attention to Colorado, and they're starting to get better recruiting at Colorado. But at the end of the day, what you do on the field is what you're going to be graded on. And I just don't think that they were that great of a team. Yes, they had 2 of the most talented people in college football, hands down, no doubt about that. Travis Hunter, generational talent, Heisman Trophy winner. I didn't think he should have won it, but he definitely deserved it. He played well enough to deserve it. I mean, generational talent. I mean, he's up there. So, all that being said, I actually ended up just gave him a C. I thought it was just a really bad year, overhyped year.
Yeah. I mean, I think the national attention the program has had, oftentimes the criticism labeled them as selfish. I don't know if they were necessarily selfish, as they might not have been as talented as their top 2 players were. If you look a little bit at their numbers, they're kind of confusing, right? So they finished 30th in the scoring offense, okay? High scoring team, right? But not that high scoring. Like, 30th is good, but you would think a team that's just passing and putting up stats and inflating numbers would be higher than that, and they weren't. They were only 69th in the country in total offense, but that's really misleading because they were 6th in the country in passing, but they were dead last in the country in rushing. So they had absolutely no support from the running game at all. Like being 134th in the country is not a result because they didn't ever try to run the ball. It's just because they were not good at it. On the defensive side of the ball, once again, you think of this team and they had some bad losses where they gave up some points they probably shouldn't have, but they were 50th in the country in total defense, 42nd in scoring defense. So right in the middle of the road there in terms of their statistics. Now, another area that does kind of stand out a little bit to go along with the idea of them being a little selfish, 121st in the country in penalties. They were not a disciplined football team. Even if you have a good passing game, if you don't have a good rushing game and you get yourself behind the chains, it's going to be hard to overcome.
They lost to Nebraska.
They did. They got beat bad by Nebraska. At the end of the day, you know, the end of the season, I think this season would have been seen even better if they had not just absolutely laid an egg against BYU in their bowl game.
Yeah. If they had the same type of season, but didn't have Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter, I would say it's a much better outlook. It's a much better grade, right?
Yeah.
But going 9-4 with this schedule, with that talent, that just tells me that the rest of that team, Deion's not doing the job to really build the program.
Yeah, I think we'll see a lot more this year. When he is
so,
down.
I mean, I'm pulling for him. I love Deion.
We'll see if his philosophy works. This is year 3, right? The remnants of that horrible team that he'd been spending 2 years to flush away and replace with his guys and his philosophy are going to be really on display this next year. Now, I've been very critical of Colorado. We were during the season, but I really, really tried to look at this in terms of what were their expectations and where has this program come? And at the end of the day, I really think they were actually a lot better of a team. And if they could have just fixed a few discipline problems and fixed their running game, they probably would have been at least in the conference championship and maybe in the playoff. So while I don't love all the results, I thought it was a good season for them. So I gave them a B+, much higher than what you did, because I think it was a pretty good job just coming from 1-11 2 years ago, 4-8 last year, to 9-4 this year, cusp of a playoff chance if they wouldn't have messed up against Kansas. I think it was a pretty good job for them.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily disagree with that. I do think what Deion has done has been good for Colorado. Like you said, coming from where they were to where they're at now, heck yeah. I mean, you take this any day of the week. I guess why I get so negative on them about being overrated is all the hype, all the press that they get, all getting pumped up. And if you have, like I said, the potential number 1 and 2 pick on your team, you better be doing better than 9-4.
Yeah. So based on their record, the record grade for this year is a B-. And overall, the Nitro Show final grade for the Colorado Buffaloes in 2024 is a B-.
And one last thing I'll say about Colorado. I hope that they're great next year. I do. I'm pulling for them. I want to go on record to say I want Colorado to be good next year. I would love to see it.
Yeah, if I will say anything for them, it showed me a lot that Deion stayed at Colorado after his sons have left.
Yeah, that is pretty surprising.
He flirted with some NFL jobs, and the fact that he stayed after his sons are gone, to me, showed that he is invested in this program. And so I hope it works out because, as we've mentioned before, We love Dion. He's an Atlanta hero.
Yeah.
And we want to see him succeed, even though we have been critical.
We'd be just as critical of any other team that got this kind of hype and had that level of talent at the top of their roster.
Yep.
Okay. Moving on to a team that did not have that level of talent. Let's talk about the Baylor Bears. So this is a much improved team from previous year. Didn't have any wins over any ranked opponents, but much improved from the year before.
Yeah, I think Dave Aranda saved his job this year. They were 3-9 last year, and it got off to a bad start this year. They started out 2-4, and 3 of those 4 losses were to ranked teams, and the other one was Colorado, who ended up ranked at the end of the year. So they were picked to finish 12th in the conference, and this was really good for them to close strong. They won their final 6 games, all in conference, before ultimately losing their bowl game to LSU. It was impressive because they had really been struggling in conference. They were 2-13 in their previous 15 conference games before that 6-game win streak at the end of the year, and they were really impressive.
It's an impressive way to close out the season.
Yeah. And they were really impressive on offense this year. That's what they were.
That's kind of their identity for the past 10 years.
Yeah, but it was different.
Bryles.
Yeah, sorry. It's not the offense that they had under Bryles a few years ago. But they were the 20th ranked offense in the country, but they were balanced. So quarterback Sawyer Robinson had 3,000 yards, 28 touchdowns. Running back Bryson Washington had over 1,000 yards and 12 touchdowns. Unfortunately, their defense was not nearly as strong. They were 81st in the country on scoring defense at 26.4 points a game. So this was an offensive-driven football team. They did knock off TCU for the first time since 2019 and only the second time in the last 10 years. That's one of their big conference in-state rivals. Pretty good year for Baylor, recovery year. I gave them a B+.
Yeah, I thought it was a good season, especially for Baylor. The losses that they had, they weren't terrible. The only one that looks really bad is that Utah one, but at the time Utah was ranked number 11, so it looked like it was a better loss than what it ended up being, and it was fairly close. So I ended up going with a B-. Since they had a winning season and they were bowl eligible, that gets them a B-. And so their final grade for the 2024 season from the Nitro Show for your Baylor Bears, they get a B-.
All right, up next, we have the TCU Horned Frogs, who in 2013 went 5-7 after getting shellacked in the national championship game by Georgia following the 2022 season. 2024, they recovered. They went 9-4 in Sonny Dykes' 3rd season. They did not finish ranked at 9-4. And it was a good season because they started out 3-3 and they ended up 9-4. So they went 6-1 down the stretch. That included a 34-3 win over Louisiana and then Mexico Bowl to close out the season. 9-4 was a good record. Unfortunately, they didn't have any wins this season over a ranked team. They didn't play a single team that was ranked this year, though SMU ended up being a playoff team and beat them 66-42. This was a monster passing season for sophomore quarterback Josh Hoover. He threw for almost 4,000 yards and 27 touchdowns while leading the country's number 8 passing offense.
He almost had 400 yards against SMU.
Yeah. But the flip side of that was they really struggled running the ball. They were 113th in the country on the ground.
Yeah, that'll do it. Yeah, looking at their rushing leaders for most of their games, they started out good against Stanford, 81 yards, by Cook, 58, 35, 24.
Yeah,
no, it's not great.
Right.
You know, they improved from the previous year. They got a little bit better. They won their bowl game. Unfortunately, they did get blown out by SMU. So I I don't think it was a great year by any stretch of the imagination, but not a terrible year.
Right. I think it was an important year for Sonny Dykes in particular because his first season they went to the national title game. Like, you can't start any better than that. And then the next year you have a losing record. You don't even get to a bowl game. And people already question, well, was that one season a fluke? Because you got beat so bad in the national championship game. Like, was that season just really a fluke?
It was.
And, well, at least I think they answered a little bit that, yes, this is a solid program that should be a contender in the conference going forward. Maybe they're not a national title contender again, but they should be a solid team.
Yeah, I mean, and they could get themselves back in the conversation easily nowadays with transfers and NIL and all that stuff. And just with the way the conferences are structured and extra playoff spots, give them a couple seasons, get a good recruiting class here and there. Sonny Dykes, I mean, he seems like he's a really good coach. So they have potential. There's some upside there.
Yeah. So, like I said, I thought it was an important year for them to get right. I gave them a B+ for this season because, like I said, I think it was important for them to show that they were getting back on the right track. What did you think, Burl?
Yeah, so since, they didn't really have any like truly impressive wins, it was just kind of a solid season, good, not great. I ended up giving them a C+.
All right. So they did go 9-4. They were bowl eligible. They had a winning record. So their record grade was a B-, and their final grade for 2024, the TCU Horned Frogs from the Nitro Show get a grade of B-.
Okay. Team that I am kind of partial to, Texas Tech Red Raiders, just because my high school, we were the Red Raiders. They did a little bit better this year than they did last year. Tell us about them.
Yeah, so in 2023, they were 7-6. This year, they won one more game, so they finished at 8-5. Third year under Coach Joey McGuire, they finished unranked because at 8-5, you're not going to finish ranked. But the season really started out with a glimpse of what this team would become as they went out. They needed overtime to defeat Abilene Christian, who's an FCS school, in the first game of the season. And they beat them 52-51. So if that says anything, they can score some points, but they're going to give up a lot of points too. And that's absolutely what this team was. They had a really, really high scoring offense. They finished 5th in the country in scoring, and that helped them rush out to a 5-1 start. That included a win over Arizona State, who ended up winning the conference. But that 5-1 start in those high-scoring games couldn't cover up the fact that their defense was almost as ungodly bad as their offense was good. They were 122nd in the country in scoring defense, the worst defense in the Big 12, the worst passing defense in the entire country. Some of their games included losses to Baylor, 59-35, to TCU, 35-34, and 41-27 to Colorado. So in all those games, they put up plenty of points to win the game. They just couldn't stop anybody.
Carson Beck could have used the game against them.
Yeah, it would help. It would have helped get him a few more dollars from Miami.
That's right. Sure. This is just a kind of a strange team. You look at their record, like you said, they go to overtime against Abilene Christian, but then they turn around and beat Arizona State, who ends up winning the whole conference. That's it, and some of their they beat Iowa State. So they beat both teams that were in their conference championship.
Right.
But then they have some really weird losses. But most of their losses were to two decent teams. I mean, Baylor and TCU, not bad. Colorado, they're not terrible either. So, and the games were, well, that Baylor game, they did kind of get stomped a little bit. TCU was close. So, just a weird season for Texas Tech.
Yeah.
You beat your conference championship teams that and then lose to some randos.
Yeah.
You lost to Washington State. I mean, come on.
Yeah, they did have some stars on their team. Obviously, when you have a high-powered offense like that, that scored over 54 times this season, their real star was Taj Brooks, their running back. He rushed for 1,500 yards on the ground, and he did that while running behind a absolutely horrible offensive line. But their offensive line was really, really bad in pass protection and in rushing protection. And Taj Brooks was able to work around it and have a great season. Their quarterback, Baron Morton, had 3,300 yards passing, 27 touchdowns. And both of their top two receivers were absolute stars, Josh Kelly and Caleb Douglas. On defense, the defense was bad. They did have a bright spot on the team. Linebacker Jacob Rodriguez had 127 tackles and 5 sacks. So he was the leader of a bad defense, but this was like I said, this was a good year for a team. Just if they could have found any way to get some stops on defense, they'd have been a lot better because they could score with anybody in the country. 8-5 season improved the record from the year before. So for me, that was a pretty good year. I gave them a grade of a B. How about you, bro?
Yeah, so I actually was a little more optimistic on them. So since they did improve their record and they had 2 really solid wins and their losses to decent teams, I actually ended up giving them a B+.
So they went 8-5. They made a bowl game. They had a winning record. So that gives them a record grade of a B-. And in 2024, the Texas Tech Red Raiders get a final grade of a B from the Nitro Show.
The Red Raiders. All right, let's head on over to Manhattan, Kansas. And we're talking about Kansas State here. So they were pretty good team this year. Same record as last year, so no real big improvements there. But ended up, for just a pretty solid year with a 9-4 record.
Yep. A repeat of the 2023 season. Of course, they were the conference champion in 2022, though people forget that they beat TCU in that conference championship game. But Kansas State has become one of those solid teams that puts up 8, 9, 10 wins a year. They've kind of found their spot in the conference, and this year started out great. They were 7-1, and they had a shot to get back to the Big 12 championship, staring them down. But then they had a really bad loss to Houston, and that kind of took them off the rails a little bit. And then they had to play Arizona State, who had gotten hot, and they lost that game, and that just totally knocked them off. So they ended up only 5-4 in conference, including losses to 3 of the top 4 teams.
Yeah. They did beat who they were supposed to beat, except for Houston, like you said. But their losses were to the conference championship representatives and BYU. So nothing to hang your head on with that. They're very respectable losses. And
yeah, this was a very solid, middle of the road team in college football this year. They were 46th in the country in scoring offense, 49th in scoring defense. So they were just equally as decent on offense as they were on defense.
They're the definition of mid.
Yeah, they really are. But they did have a couple of players who were not mid, particularly running back DJ Giddens. He was awesome. He had 1,300 yards rushing. 6-year senior defensive end Brendan Mott led the team with 8.5 sacks. He was first team all conference. And quarterback Avery Johnson, while didn't put up great stats, he did improve throughout the year, and he's going to be back next year. And I know that they have a lot of faith that he's going to be a star for them in the future.
Yeah, man, Giddens was really good.
Yeah, 6.5 yards a carry.
Mm-hmm. Multiple 100-yard games. 280-plus yard games in a row. Oklahoma State and Colorado.
Yeah.
Most impressive.
So they did close out their year with a win in their bowl game. They beat Rutgers. But for a team that a couple years ago was a conference champion, went 9-4, going 9-4 this year again. First year in this new Big 12 with a number of new teams and their losses kind of all being to the top teams. I only gave them a C+ for this year.
So I think we have an anomaly here. I gave them a B. Maybe it should be lower. Just I don't know. I feel like a B is just like right in the middle,
Yeah.
or close to the middle. You know,
They were kind of right in the middle.
it's just average. You know, so B. As far as their record goes, they had a winning season. They were bowl eligible and won their bowl game, so they get a B- for their record grade. And the final grade by the Nitro Show for the Kansas State Wildcats is a B-. All right. Well, let's go over to one of our favorite sports guys, alma mater.
Country
West
roads,
Virginia.
take me home.
Heck yeah. So my daughter, she had a music class at school the other day, and they had to vote on which songs they liked the best. And one of the songs was Country Roads, and it won.
Nice.
I was like, I'm proud of y'all.
I don't think my kids have ever heard Country Road Take Me Home. So they couldn't tell you who John Denver was.
Oh, I don't know if they knew who John Denver was at all, but they knew Country Roads.
All right.
I was proud of them. Okay. So yeah, gosh, they had a fallback of a season, just not a good season. Tell us a little bit about it, Streit.
Yeah, this was not a good year for West Virginia. They've been in the conference for a few years now, and with all these teams coming in, they had hopes that they were going to be a good team in the upper half of the conference this year. Neil Brown in his 6th season, they had the first game of the season was very, very highly anticipated. Pat McAfee, who obviously is a West Virginia alumni, hosted his show on that Friday before the first week of the season. They were hosting Penn State. Everybody was all fired up. And then they lost 37-12.
Yeah, they absolutely smoked.
Yeah. So West Virginia had kind of been trapped in this lull where they would win 5, 6, 7 games pretty much every year since they've been in the Big 12. And then last year they improved and they were 9-4. And so they were really hoping that this season was going to be another good season. Unfortunately, they ended up finishing 6-7. That included a 42-37 loss to Memphis in the Frisco Bowl. And Coach Neil Brown got fired before the bowl game at the end of the season. Chad Scott coached them in the bowl game. Defense was just really bad. They fired their defensive coordinator mid-season, and it didn't get any better. They were 111th in total defense, really, really mostly thanks to horrible pass defense, 126th in the country, 110th in scoring defense, 98th in sacks, 118th in interceptions, and 118th in turnovers.
Just bad.
Just really bad on defense, like not doing anything to help them out.
No, not really much good that we can say about West Virginia this past year. I mean, like we talked about earlier, they got smoked by Penn State. They lost to Pitt, their biggest rival, and didn't have any real good wins to show for themselves. The best thing that they had going for them this year was they rehired Rich Rod.
Right. Yeah, this team, they just didn't really have any stars. Like, they didn't have any standout players on offense, any standout players on defense. The losses were bad, and their fan base, which is a pretty loyal fan base, just lost faith in their coach. They wanted him gone, and he was fired. And now they're turning to Rich Rodriguez, who's coming back to Morgantown after, being gone, multiple stops on the way, Michigan, Arizona, a couple other places. And we'll see if they can rekindle the magic that they had, back in 2005, 2006.
Yeah, it's working for Rutgers.
It is. Shiama's doing a good job there.
Do you think Rich Rod can rekindle the success? Is he going to go clone Pat White and Steve Slayton?
I don't know. he's been up and down in his time gone. He had a couple good years at Michigan, some bad years at Michigan. He had a couple good years at Arizona, some bad years at Arizona. He's just been kind of up and down. And it's been almost 20 years since he was the hot name in the college coaching world that almost got the job at Alabama. So we'll see if he can come back home to his alma mater and right the ship. They certainly have support, having Pat McAfee as their biggest supporter and on TV every week and talking about them a lot certainly helps. I think that's
Nick Saban.
And Nick, yeah. But I mean, McAfee on his show every day kind of has helped grow their image with the young folks. Obviously, Nick Saban went there and is on game day as well. But this was a bad year for them. They fired their coach, and there just wasn't much memorable about this season. I gave them a C-.
Yeah, definitely a season to forget. And I gave them a C- as well.
So because they did make a bowl game, but they ended up losing and ended up with a losing record, they get a C+ for their record grade. And their final grade in 2024 from the Nitro Show, West Virginia Mountaineers get a grade of a C-.
West by God, Virginia.
Up next, we have the Kansas Jayhawks. 2023, they were 9-4 and had a lot of optimism coming into this season. Fourth year for Coach Lance Leopold. And the best way I can describe Kansas this year is just weird. Considered one of the favorites in the conference. They were picked fourth in the conference in the preseason poll. And they got off to a horrible start. They were 1-5, but here's the kicker. They actually had a positive scoring margin in those first 6 games. The largest margin that they lost was 38-27 to TCU. So they were 1-5. They were outscoring opponents on the season, and it was just weird. And things would get even weirder. So they beat Houston to get to 2-5. They almost upset Kansas State, and they lost 29-27. But this close loss was the start of an improbable turn for them. Their next 3 games were all against ranked teams, and they won them all. Iowa State, who played for the conference championship, BYU, who ended up, having a really great season, and Colorado, who had a great season. So
BYU was ranked number 6 at the time.
Right. So it was weird. This team that preseason people thought was going to be good, got off to this horrible start, was kind of an anomaly in terms of their scoring, all of a sudden figured it out and beat 3 great teams all in a row.
Well, first off, it's just weird thinking that Kansas is going to be good at football, just in general. But past few years, they've been really, really solid and had some expectations going into this year. But they did take a huge step back. The interesting thing that I thought about just looking at all the games is that all of their losses, with the exception of Baylor, were 1-score games.
Right.
They had a chance to be a really, really good team, but just couldn't pull it off in the early part of the season. But they did finish really, really strong, like you said. And since they did take that big step back and had the expectations, it's one of the rare times again I went with a C.
Yeah. So I did want to highlight that probably their most important game of the year was the victory over Colorado. Colorado came in that game thinking they were headed to the playoffs, and Kansas just stomped them, and it was really, really on the running of Devin Neal. The dude had 204 yards rushing in the game, 3 rushing touchdowns, but not only that, he also had 80 yards receiving and another touchdown. So 284 total yards, 4 touchdowns. Devin Neal single-handedly dashed Colorado's playoff hopes.
Wow.
Yeah. So, like I said, that was a really important win for them. Unfortunately, they did miss out on a bowl game because they lost their last game of the season to Baylor, 45-17. So they ended up finishing 5-7, but they had that crazy stretch of 3 straight wins over ranked teams, all these close losses. I gave them a C+, despite the fact that they had a losing record.
Interesting. So since they only had 5 wins, Their record grade is a C plus. So that means that the final grade for the Kansas Jayhawks from the Nitro Show is a C. On to Cincinnati. Definitely not the teams of Desmond Ritter anymore. Those days are gone. It's weird that they're in the Big 12 too. Kind of like West Virginia. Not anywhere close to middle Southwest, but I digress.
But you got teams in California and the ACC now. So
I know, and same thing. Big 12 or Big 10. Wild times in college football. So yeah, tell us a little bit about the Natty this year.
Yeah, the expectations weren't very high for Cincinnati this season. They were 3-9 last year, and I don't think they were picked to finish very high in the conference. But the year actually got off to a pretty good start. They were 5-2, including a victory over Arizona State, had them feeling kind of good, and then they lost their last 5 games. Scoring was a major issue for them. They failed to score at least 30 points in 9 of their 12 games this year. They finished 89th in the country overall in scoring, and they had a bunch of missed opportunities. They had losses to Pittsburgh by 1 point, Texas Tech by 3 points, and Colorado by 1 point. So, I mean, you lose 3 games by 5 points, and you end up missing a bowl game. That kind of sucks. If they did have one bright spot and hope for the future, it was the play of quarterback Brendan Sorsby. He had 2,800 yards passing, 18 touchdowns, and he also had 447 yards rushing. So he's a young quarterback. He'll be back next year. But overall, it was just kind of a down year for them, missing a bowl game again. This was the second straight year that they missed a bowl game after making a bowl game 5 straight years when Luke Fickell was the coach. Scott Satterfield in his second season is not living up to the expectations. So his job may be in danger in the next couple of years if he doesn't get it turned around.
Yeah, this is kind of another weird kind of schedule, how it ended up being, as they started out pretty good, like you said, but then they just tanked after that outlier win against Arizona State. How did they beat Arizona State? That makes 0 sense. But yeah, that's, I guess, college football nowadays.
I think Arizona State hadn't found its stride yet, and they did down the stretch.
Yeah, maybe that was the game that got them right.
Yeah, could be.
Maybe. But yeah, they just tanked the rest of the season though, and wasn't even really. It wasn't close in any of those games. So yeah, not a good year. Not a good year. I ended up going with a C-.
Yeah, I also gave them a C-. They went 5-7, so their record grade was a C+. So in 2024, the Nitro Show season grade for the Cincinnati Bearcats is a C-. Up next, we have our second set of Cougars in the Big 12 Conference. This time it's the Houston Cougars. This was their first season under Willie Fritz, who you may have heard that name. He's bounced around a lot. He was the coach at Georgia Southern for a while. Came over to take over a program that was 4-8 in 2023, and they went 4-8 again this year. The story of this season for Houston was that they were just god-awful horrible at offense. 133rd in the country out of 134 teams. It was the first time in the season that they'd scored under 200 points in a season since 2001. In 2001, they won 0 games. So the fact that they somehow won 4 games and they scored under 200 points was kind of a minor miracle.
Yeah, especially when you look at some of the teams that they beat. TCU, Kansas State.
Right. Right. They in the Kansas State game in particular, they had to come back and win it in the fourth quarter, and their quarterback played by far his best quarter of football all season. He was perfect, rallying them to victory. His name is Zion Chris. That was like his highlight of the season. Their defense was good. I mean, their offense was so bad Their defense was 26th in the country in total defense.
That's pretty
defense.
good.
Yeah. Defensive back AJ Halsey had 5 picks. So it's even more impressive when you consider that they couldn't move the football at all on offense. So they were punting a lot, giving the other team the ball a lot, and they finished 26th in the country in total defense. Like, if they would have been 100th in the country in offense, shoot, they could have been top 10 defense. But they couldn't. They just could not move the ball. They closed out their season with 3 straight double-digit losses. This was a bad first year for Willie Fritz there. They're going to have to turn it around. It's unfortunate that their defense was pretty good, but their offense was just so bad. I gave them a D.
Yeah, if someone were to ask me, hey, how did Houston Cougars do in 2024? I'd say, well, they lost to a really crappy Oklahoma team. And that will pretty much sum it up. So I also gave them a D.
Yeah. So for a 4-8 record, their record grade is a C minus. And in 2024, the Houston Cougars from the Nitro Show get a final grade of a D.
Next, we got Utah, the Utah Utes. Really disappointing season for Kyle Winningham and the Fighting Kyle Winninghams here. They're typically known to be a very solid program. Multiple 10-plus win seasons. They're usually in the conversation for winning their conference, sometimes around the playoff, but just a big step back for Utah this year.
Yeah, they were the preseason favorite to win the conference in their first year, moving over from the Pac-12 to the Big 12. It didn't happen, man. This was a bad year. Longtime quarterback Cam Rising, who has been there for like 6 years, was back again because he got hurt again. He was expected to lead the team, but injuries, just like previous seasons, plagued him. He only played,
though, right?
Yeah, but he left the team, so he's not back for a 7th year. He only ended up playing in 3 games, none after their October 11th loss to Arizona State, but he really basically played the first 2 games of the year before he got hurt. And once he was out, the quarterback position was a mess.
Yeah, we're good through those first 4 games. It looked like they might have a chance even after Cam went down, but once they got past Oklahoma State, they just tanked the rest of the way through the season.
Which Oklahoma State was ranked at the time they played them, which is very funny because how bad they ended up being. But yeah, after that game, they were 4-0 after that game, but then they lost 7 in a row. They did manage to win their last game of the season, defeating UCF. But offense was just bad. Without any stability at the quarterback position, they were 115th in the country in offense. They had a 1,000-yard rusher, but they just didn't have a pass game. Their defense was decent, 25th ranked scoring defense, but, you know, they just, much like we talked about Houston before, they just couldn't make up for the deficiencies between their defense and offense.
Yep. No real notable wins. It's, like I said, not what we're used to seeing from Utah. They're usually really solid on defense, good enough on an offense, and it just wasn't there this year. And since it was such a big step back and you had those expectations, I actually gave them a D+.
I gave them a C-. I think the injury to Cam Rising was a huge deal to them, and they really couldn't recover at the quarterback position, which just totally derailed their offense after that point. So I was a little more lenient, but I gave them a C- for this season.
Since they won 5 games, that gets them a C for the record grade. So that gives the Utah Utes 2024 Nitro Show final grade as a C-.
Up next, we have the University of Central Florida Knights in the 4th season under Coach Gus Malzahn. UCF, who had been a bowl team pretty consistently for a long time, fell back to 4-8 this year. after going 6-7 last year, it was their second straight losing season under Gus Malzahn, which prompted him to, even though they didn't fire him, he left to take an offensive coordinator job in the offseason, and he went to Florida State. So you knew things were bad.
The Gus bus left town and no one wanted to ride.
Yeah. Much like a lot of these teams we've seen here in the Big 12, they got off to a good start. They were 3-0 to start the season. But then after that, they only won one game, and that was over Arizona in the next 9. As usual, under a Gus Malzahn offense, they were really good running the football. They were 5th in the country, but their passing game was bad, 97th. They were really led by running back R.J. Harvey. He had 1,500 yards and 22 touchdowns. Absolutely fantastic, but also absolutely the entire team. Like, this dude was it for them. And in researching, about their season, some of their fans were like, can you imagine what our season would have been without him in the backfield? Because it would have just been bad. Their defense was serviceable. It was 37th in the country, but scoring-wise, they were 82nd in the country. And that's because of turnovers, where they finished 115th in the country in turnover margin. They tried some midseason coaching changes, replacing the offensive coordinator and the defensive coordinator, but it didn't work. This was their first time missing a bowl game since 2015. And if you look back, that 2015 season was when Scott Frost was the coach there, who's ironically coming back. And that year they went winless.
Another retread.
Yeah. But that year, that 2015 year, they went winless. They went 0-12 that year. And since that year, they'd been to a bowl game every season since then up until this year. So Gus Malzahn got the heck out of Dodge. It'll be a new regime next year. But this was a bad year for them. I gave them a grade of a D.
Yeah, pretty terrible season. It looked like it would, there would be some promise after beating TCU, but then they crapped the bed the rest of the year, losing all but one of their remaining games. The interesting thing though is most of their losses were pretty close. Like they weren't blown out in any of the games except for maybe Colorado. You might be able to call that a blowout. It was more than 20 points, but still just not a good season. Gus Malzahn's not helping his career very much here, but somehow they hired him at Florida State. Don't know if that's going to help him very much, but we'll see. So I ended up giving him a D as well.
So their record grade for the season was a C-, and for the Nitro Show final grade for the UCF Knights in 2024 is a D.
Okay. Almost there, folks. We're down to the final 2. So we're going to move on to the Arizona Wildcats. Tell us about their season, Streit.
2023, Arizona was a good football team. They were 10-3, had a lot of momentum. So in 2024, Brett Brennan took over as coach, and they fell way back. They finished with a record of 4-8. They managed to keep some players that considered transferring during the coaching change. And so that kind of kept some of the momentum going. Quarterback Noah Fafita and star receiver Tatoria McMillan, who...
Very nice.
If you don't know anything about Tatoria McMillan, he's probably going to be one of the top 10 players taken in the NFL draft. Absolutely awesome player on a really, really bad football team. They were one of the preseason favorites in the conference, but statistically, they were one of the worst teams in the country. They finished 116th in the country in scoring, and they gave up 31.8 points a game, which was 109th. So they're bad on offense, bad on defense.
Yeah, just a big step backwards for this team. They seemed like a team that was on the rise as a program, had some expectations coming into the year, and ended up just having a very, very disappointing year. And you kind of knew that they were going to struggle after the Northern Arizona game, where they barely beat a team that I've never heard of before by 12. So that's not what you really expect from a team that has those type of expectations. But then, after that, they got blown out the next week by Kansas State, and the rest of the season just was a dumpster fire. So they did bounce back and beat Utah, who was number 10 at the time, but overall just a bad season.
Yeah, this season ended absolutely horrible. Playing Arizona State, in-state rival, who they had, beaten a few times, and coming into the season, Arizona was supposed to be the good program in the state. Arizona State was picked last in the conference. Arizona State, as we know, had gotten hot at that point and just shellacked them 49-7. They finished up.
The tables have turned.
Yeah, they finished up 4-8. Just a bad year. I gave them a D.
Yeah, I actually gave them a D- because it was such a huge step back. I just thought it was just a very, very poor year.
Yeah. So their record at 4-8 gives them a record grade of C-. And in 2024, the Nitro Show final grade for the Arizona Wildcats is a D.
Okay. So what are the odds that both major Oklahoma football teams have terrible seasons? Well, apparently they're pretty high this year, or this past year.
Yeah.
Because it's
pretty low, because they both historically are strong programs and have been good in their respective conferences recently, but this was not a good year for Oklahoma State. This team in their 20th year under Mike Gundy. Mike Gundy's been the coach there for 20 years.
Wow.
The coach before Mike Gundy was Les Miles. If that tells you anything, how long that guy's been there. Wow. The guy who once said, I'm a man, I'm 40, is now almost 60. So, yeah, I mean, but this, much like Florida State, Oklahoma State being this bad this year is just baffling. This is a team that consistently wins 8 to 10 games every year. And it was an absolute dumpster fire this year.
Not a typical year for Mike Gundy. I'm actually thinking he's kind of like the Mark Richt of the Big 12 normally. But this year was just bad.
I mean, they were picked to finish third in the conference, and they started out 3-0. And then they lost their next 9 games. They had the number 1 returning running back in the country, and Ollie Gordon coming back. And he had a horrible year. Like, they just, the season just went off the rails, and it just steamrolled on them.
Yeah, it did start out pretty decent. I mean, they got a win over Arkansas, but then, lost after the Tulsa game. They just lost everything.
Those 9 losses to close out the season, 6 of them were by double digits. So they were only even in 3 of them. And the season ended with the worst loss of the season. That was to Colorado. They lost 52-0.
Yeah, it's not good.
No. And like I said, I mentioned Ollie Gordon. The dude rushed for 1,700 yards last year and was expected to be a Heisman Trophy contender, a top draft pick. Like, I haven't heard him mention in draft stuff this year. He only ran for like 800 yards this year. Like, wow. It was just really bad. After the season, Mike Gundy was fired, but then unfired because he agreed to take like a huge pay cut and agreed to like replace all his coaches and everything.
If you don't take a pay cut, we're going to fire you.
And like, I think he was fired, but then they brought him back. Like I said, just a god-awful season for them.
Does he count as a retread next year?
And at the end of the day, it was really hard for me to pick who was the worst team in the country this year between Oklahoma State, Florida State, and Purdue. Like, Oklahoma State won the most games, but they certainly played the worst the last 9 games of the season. Florida State was god-awful all year, and Purdue was god-awful all year. So Oklahoma State Purdue, Florida State were definitely your 3 worst teams in the country this year. No doubt this was a horrible year for them. I gave them an F.
Yeah, super disappointing if you're a Cowboys fan, which tracks. Sorry, Pokes, but it's an F.
So because they did win a few games, their record grade was a D+. But at the end of the day, the Nitro Show grade for the Oklahoma State Cowboys in 2024 is an F.
And that will wrap up our season grades for all of the teams in the Power Four. We did it.
We did it. Any final thoughts, Burl?
Holy. This has been fun, man. It's been kind of educational in a way, getting to know a lot of these other teams. You know, as Georgia fans, we hyper focus on Georgia and the SEC, so it's been kind of fun seeing some of the outcomes of these other teams and getting to know them a little better.
Yeah, it certainly has been cool to learn more than just, if you're a college football fan, you know the good teams, the teams that are ranked and the teams that are up near the top. And a lot of times you hear about the horrible teams as well, but the guys in the middle kind of get lost throughout the season. And as you mentioned, we talk a lot about the SEC throughout the year, so we know those teams, but we don't hear about teams from the Big 12 or, from the ACC that much because, frankly, we just don't encounter them much in the season. So this was a lot of fun for me. I love statistics and I loved learning the stat side and how these teams did and learning about who their head coaches are. And I think, this podcast is relatively new. Next year will be our second year, and I hope it helps make me better understanding when we talk about other teams, kind of what happened this year and how that tracks into next year.
Yeah, I'm still going to talk crap.
All right. Well, once again, thank you for listening to the show. If you haven't already, please subscribe. And we will see you again next week when we get back into spring practice. Until then, I'm Streit.
I'm Burl.
Go Dogs.
Go Dogs.